Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, on a Saturday. We hope this will be an extremely useful, about 75 minutes or maybe hour and a half, depending on how chatty we are. My name is April Ladinsky. I'm the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program here on campus. I'm also the co-chair of the Community Action Partners of Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky, along with Marcia here. So I'll let Marcia introduce herself.
Hi. I'm Marcia Tatay. I'm the co-chair with my superhero beside me, and we just like to, keep the community informed and try and get action happening so that our community is available to all women.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction, and then the scope of our time today will be, we have 4 presenters, and we're so happy that they're sharing their expertise and insights with us today. They'll each speak fairly briefly, and then the bulk of the time will be Q&A, conversation that we hope will be very progressive in terms of thinking about what we can do in our community to have more than the pro and con kinds of conversations. I think it's pretty clear we know how to shout at each other already. And we'd like to really think about what would it look like to move the conversation forward, to think about more productive kinds of finding common ground so that we can have more progressive and accessible reproductive health in our community. So the Community Action Board, Community Action Partners, just as IUSB, is organized around education. So if this is your first time on our campus, welcome. If you are, how many of you are grads of one of our programs here? So yay, welcome back. We're always really happy to see you, and we're happy to have the community. We really do think of ourselves as the community's university, and we are thrilled that you're here. So in the back of the room, if you didn't get a chance to pick things up, there's a lot of information both about Community Action Partners, about Planned Parenthood, about bills that are coming up before the state legislature that you might want to be informed about, and also a packet on how to act, whether that is simply writing letters or calling your representatives. So that's one thing we can really do as citizen activists, is just really pay attention, listen, and make sure that our representatives know how we feel. So to that end, I want to just say how grateful I am that Lynn Coleman is here today. So Lynn, will you wait? So Lynn Coleman, as you probably know, is going to challenge Jackie Walorski for the heavily gerrymandered district that we're living in. And I'm so pleased that he's here. He's here to listen. I hope afterwards you'll go up and introduce yourself and let him know how happy you are that he's also here to listen and learn from us. So I'm really grateful that you're here. The back of the room, I'm also just going to say briefly, there's a couple upcoming events that might be of interest to folks like you. So on February 11th, we have a disordered eating event that will take place in here. What Are You Hungry For? That's going to be part Mary Beth Saunders, a playwright, presenting her one-woman show about the issue of eating disorders, and also a panel of experts about resources in our community. The Michiana Monologues is also coming up late February and early March. You can find information at michianamonologues.org. That is a fundraiser for local organizations that work to stop violence against women and to promote health care for women, and Planned Parenthood is one of the beneficiaries of that event. So it's going to be a smashing show this year. So I'll also just say that there are free books. How many of you like free books? Okay, so there are free books over here. Cathopolits Pro, which is a tour de force for people who want to think about how to speak in different kinds of ways, in fruitful kinds of ways, I would argue, about reproductive rights. There are 30 of these community copies of Pro circulating. How many of you have had one, have touched one? Some of you, okay. So there's instructions for how to use this book for good. And the idea is that you keep this book for a little bit, you write about it, you share the ideas. You can just read the first chapter if you like, to be empowered by the way she reframes the debate. And then you pass it along to somebody else. So please feel free. There's a few more copies over there before you go. So let me introduce our speakers, and then they're just going to speak down the table here. And we're, again, very grateful that they are sharing their Saturday with us. And so I'm just thrilled that folks showed up for all of us. So first we have Professor Jay Tidmarsh here from the University of Notre Dame School of Law, who's going to be talking with us about the language of Roe. And for those of us who didn't go to law school, I hope some real takeaways for the import of that law, both strengths and shortcomings. Jason Critchlow will speak next. He's the Democratic Party chair in our community in St. Joseph County, and he's going to be talking about the policy implications of Roe. And then Charlotte Pfeiffer next. Everyone knows Charlotte Pfeiffer. She's an associate faculty in social work, and she teaches also for the Women's and Gender Studies program, which I'm really thrilled about. Mover and shaker in our community, and she's going to be talking about the community impact of reproductive rights issues. And then Cynthia Murphy, one of my wonderful colleagues here, she is the recruitment and retention counselor in the Office of Admissions at IUSB, and she's agreed to speak about the Latino community and conversations around reproductive rights, both in their personal life and in the community. So I think you'll get a lot of different kinds of footholds in this conversation. We'll hear from everybody, and then we'll have Q&A that I hope will be really productive. So please help me in thanking and welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, April. I don't know if everybody else is going to stand, but I'm a professor and a lawyer by trade, so my brain does not engage until I stand up. So I'm going to stand and then talk a little bit about the law that behind where we stand today with reproductive rights, including a case that's before the Supreme Court this term. Just talk a little bit about it, but just so they have a vocabulary and kind of an understanding about how the law looks at this issue of reproductive rights, particularly with regard to the right to choose. Obviously, of course, in a sense, it begins with Roe versus Wade back in 1973. With some famous language out of Roe versus Wade. But of course, no case in the Supreme Court is ever without its background or what lies behind it. As the court says in Roe versus Wade, and I just picked out a couple of quotes from Roe versus Wade itself, there's no text in the Constitution that says we enjoy a right of privacy. But over a range of cases leading up to Roe versus Wade, the court had recognized a number of instances in which legislatures could not interfere with what you might loosely regard as being privacy rights, as it says here, in particular, certain kinds of rights regarding marriage, procreation, contraception, family relationships, child rearing, child education. So there are a number of instances where even before Roe, the court had said that certain kinds of decisions were out of bounds for legislative tampering. That then leads to in Roe versus Wade, a recognition, though, that the state also has certain interests and has interests with regard to reproductive rights. So Roe is really fundamentally a decision that's trying to balance interests. The interests on the one hand of the woman, the interests on the state on the other hand. And so, particularly with regard to the woman's interest, it recognizes that there are three interests. The first is that there may be medical harms that come to the woman if she carries her fetus to term. The second is that there may be distress that a woman suffers. Roe talks about this in various ways. Mental distress, psychological distress that comes from both the pregnancy itself as well as from the reality of having an additional child to raise. And then the psychological harm to the woman, to the family, and to an unwanted child. So all of those are reasons to respect a right of privacy for a woman to decide and to choose for herself whether or not to carry to term. On the other hand, the court recognizes the state has interests, and it also identifies three interests to the contrary. The first of them is to safeguard the health of the mother. The mother's a citizen of the state, so obviously the state has an interest in ensuring the mother's health. The second is in maintaining medical standards within the state. And then the third is in protecting the life of the fetus, the potential life that the fetus represents. So those are the interests that are on both sides of this equation. It's not simply a right of privacy, but it is a right of privacy and concerns for the mother, but then also, of course, there are state interests as well. And what that leads to then, of course, is the really famous trimester framework of Roe versus Wade that, in essence, first of all, in the first trimester, the court says the states can essentially not regulate abortion or the right to obtain an abortion. The reason being, of course, that during that first trimester, at least at the time that the decision was written, a procedure to have an abortion was actually safer than carrying the fetus to term. So it was actually, as the court said, there's very little interest during that first trimester that the state could have in regulating the safety, the health of the mother, because the health of the mother is actually advanced by terminating the pregnancy rather than going on to term. And the fetus wasn't viable. So the interests of the state in that first trimester, extremely limited. In the middle trimester, the second trimester, then the court recognizes that while, of course, the fetus is not yet viable, at that point things turn so that having a pregnancy during that second trimester is more risky to the mother, and therefore the state has an interest in protecting the health of the mother, so it can impose regulations on abortions that are for the safety or the health of the mother, but only those kinds of regulations. And then finally, in the third trimester, when, again, the medicine at the time, that's when the fetus becomes viable. Then the state has an interest, both in regulating the health of the mother, regulating procedures for the health of the mother, and also in protecting the unborn fetus. And so at that point then, the regulations, the state's ability to regulate abortion procedures becomes strongest, and therefore, at that point then, a state that wishes to could pass regulations essentially outline later abortions. So that's the framework of Roe versus Wade. As you can well imagine, medicine changes, right, in both ways. First of all, procedures to obtain abortion become safer so that even beyond the first trimester, it still now remains true that it is, from the point of view of the woman, safer to have an abortion than it is to carry the fetus to term. On the other hand, it's also true that viability is pushing back in the other direction, so that a fetus now is viable even at less than the third trimester. So the framework gets under a lot of pressure, just factual pressure or medical technology pressure. And so while there are a number of cases between that, I think the next important case in the line is Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, 19 years after Roe versus Wade, after the court has worked through various aspects of Roe versus Wade. Finally, what Casey does most famously is it redefines Roe versus Wade entirely. What it does is it continues to recognize, this is a long quote and you don't have to read it all, but it continues to recognize that there is a right of privacy that surrounds Roe. It recognizes that fundamental insight of Roe should continue to remain, and the right of privacy should continue to be protected. The third sentence down is probably the famous sentence at the heart of liberty, this right of liberty or privacy that we have from state interference, is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. That one sentence nearly gave Justice Scalia a heart attack in 1992. Did not, but you could well imagine how he reacted to it. Similar language, of course, by Justice Kennedy, who was one of the three authors of this language in Obergefell this year, really did give Justice Scalia, I think, some serious health concerns. But that's the idea, at least, that there is this fundamental right to order your own existence that the state cannot interfere with, that lies at the heart of it. On the other hand, the court recognizes that because of various changes in technology, that we cannot maintain the standard trimester framework. So what it does instead is it develops what is now called the undue burden framework. So that a state is not allowed to unduly burden the right, contraceptive rights or reproductive rights. On the other hand, if it's not an undue burden, then a state is free to enact legislation to, in various ways, restrict or limit or regulate the right to seek an abortion. And so particularly in Casey itself, for instance, a 24-hour waiting period, that was okay. That was not an undue burden. Legislatures could require that when a woman first came to seek an abortion, she could then be required to wait 24 hours before coming back for the procedure itself. Parental consent for minors seeking to terminate their pregnancies, also okay. As long as there was a judicial bypass. Now, the court had already recognized that in the past, but it continues to uphold it in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Reporting requirements that would be imposed on doctors or clinics that were involved in terminating pregnancies. Those were okay, some of which were rather substantial reporting requirements. Those would all be okay. The only thing, actually, that Planned Parenthood versus Casey said was an undue burden was a married woman's, or a requirement in the statute that was at stake there, that a married woman obtain the consent of her husband before having an abortion. But otherwise, Casey, it creates this undue burden framework. But when you actually look at what Casey does, largely what Casey does is it upholds regulations and restrictions on abortion. And what it does then is it sets up what has been really for the last 20 years, the politics of abortion that Jason's going to be talking about. Because now we have this framework where the question is, are the regulations that are being imposed undue burdens on contraceptive and reproductive rights, or are they not? Against a backdrop where the court has said a lot of regulations are okay. They're not undue burdens. And so legislators for the last 20 plus years have been very creative in developing other kinds of restrictions and limits on abortions, putting them into legislation. They keep getting run up against Casey in various ways. A couple of them to mention just quickly, Gonzalez versus Carhart. There were others, but Gonzalez versus Carhart is where Congress itself passes legislation to prevent a particular kind of D&E procedure in the second trimester. The court upholds that, saying that is not an undue burden. 5-4 decision, it's a very close decision, and Justice Kennedy, who had actually been involved in one of the justices in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, upholding and agreeing that Roe should continue to exist, actually signs on with the majority in that case. And so, showing that Roe continues to be on rather thin ground. The argument that's made in Gonzalez is that there were other procedures that could still be used, so that's why eliminating this one procedure was not in itself an undue burden. There's a case coming up this year. It's going to be argued at the very end of February, so in roughly 1 month, Whole Women's Health. Again, we have new members of the court, so we're not completely clear where things will stand. Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan are new to the court since the court's last decision regarding Roe. So we'll have to see how things stand. Some people are looking at this again as a case that may redefine Roe versus Wade and perhaps eliminate it. We'll just have to see. Much hinges as we expect on how Justice Kennedy views the particular restrictions here. What's going on here, and this is of course a common thing, it's something that's been going on in Indiana as well. This was a Texas legislation, and in Texas they required that the only doctors who could terminate pregnancies were doctors who had admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of the clinic or the office at which the procedure took place. So that's the first requirement. Essentially upheld, I'll talk in just a second, but the lower court upheld the admitting privileges. And second of all, the legislation required that any facility or office at which abortions were performed needed to comply with the same standards as ambulatory surgical centers would comply with. So all of the kinds of regulations that like the South Bend Clinic, ambulatory surgery center or whatever, those kinds of requirements also had to be met by any facility that was involved in providing abortions. So we'll see. And in both instances, the lower court said those restrictions are okay, even though the effect of those restrictions was in many instances to put out of business a number of abortion providers in the state of Texas, sometimes requiring women to travel as much as 150 miles or more to terminate their pregnancies. The Fifth Circuit, which is where this case came from, did recognize, though, that in one instance with one clinic in one location, McAllen, Texas, it would have required a woman to have driven 300 miles, and that was an undue burden. So apparently how much the legislature can restrict abortions depends on how long a drive you've got to the next clinic. That seems to be at least some of what's going on there. Okay, very, very briefly, I just want to say this, and you know, the challenge of Roe from the lawyer's point of view, not from the politicians or the citizens' point of view, but from the lawyer's point of view, is exactly how do you justify it? And, you know, going back to the very beginning of Roe versus Wade, there's no right to privacy in the Constitution itself. And maybe we think there should be or there is, but there isn't. The best we probably have, in a sense, is the 14th Amendment. And if you read the 14th Amendment, it says a lot of things. The first sentence overrules Dred Scott. That has nothing to do with, obviously, Roe versus Wade. It has a lot to do with Ted Cruz, though, these days. The first sentence, we can sort of take that one out. There are 3 rights given to us by the 14th Amendment. We enjoy certain privileges and immunities from state interference. We are entitled to not have our life, liberty, or property deprived without due process by the state, and the state cannot deny us equal protection of the laws. For various reasons not worth talking about, that first clause doesn't mean anything, and it hasn't meant anything since a few years after it was enacted back in the 1800s. The third clause, the Equal Protection Clause, doesn't mean a lot either. There are certain ways in which, because this is a gendered issue, you can make certain equal protection arguments with regard to reproductive rights, but as a general proposition, for reasons, again, I'd be happy to talk about, the Equal Protection Clause does not have a lot to say about reproductive choice. So what you're left with then is what is the due process, what's called usually the Due Process Clause. That is how the court has read all of this, whatever it is that Casey says, it is read through the Due Process Clause, which doesn't seem like it would apply because it's about process, not about liberty as such, but the court has used that clause as the relevant clause. And that leads to a last problem. I just want to end on this, because this is going to be the political discussion. You'll hear this over the course of the next few months as you're talking about going on, presidential candidates. You're going to have a theory of how you interpret that clause, right? What are and fundamentally what Roe is about, and this whole issue about reproductive rights from a constitutional perspective, is how do you interpret the Constitution? The Constitution itself does not say anything about reproductive rights. So how do you interpret the Constitution? There are a lot of theories of constitutional interpretation: textualism, which would not support Roe versus Wade; originalism, what did the people who drafted it originally think these words meant? That would probably not support Roe versus Wade. So as you hear people over the next few months say, I'm a textualist, or presidential candidates saying, I'm going to appoint justices who are textualists or who are originalists, what they are saying, and what certain people understand they are saying, is that they are going to appoint judges who are going to overrule Roe versus Wade. That's fundamentally what's being said. It's not said as such, but that's what's understood. That's what's being said. There are some other views, majoritarianism, that generally we don't strike down legislation that the legislature enacts. That's challenging for Roe versus Wade as well, because we live in a democracy, and generally speaking, in a democracy, majorities win, right? And so how do you create a right around reproductive freedom that doesn't generally say that legislatures can't do and enact other kinds of legislation? There are process theories of the Constitution that basically it's not the job of the courts to do anything other than make sure that discrete and insular minorities are protected, and women are not a discrete and insular minority, so those theories don't support Roe versus Wade. The only theories that do are some kinds of living constitutional theories, that somehow there is just, that the law evolves, it changes, we recognize liberty interests today that we didn't recognize 30, 40 years ago, or maybe even 100 years ago, or back when the Constitution was drafted. And those are the theories that ultimately underlie Roe versus Wade. They underlie Obergefell, this term as well. The theory that same-sex marriage is not a matter for state regulation. So as you think about this, you do have to have a theory, a reason why, at least from a constitutional point of view, Roe versus Wade is right, as against the state interests that lie on the other side. So there's just a few things to think about. That has nothing to do with the politics of it, of course, and that's what Jason is going to talk about.
So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. It's sort of a dangerous thing. You never give a political operative a podium and a microphone and just say, oh, just tell us what you think. Yeah, the stopwatch, that's always important. Well, actually, so it was said, Jason's going to talk about policy, and so in preparing for today, I kind of thought about what does that mean? Where do I start? Where do I end? When the stopwatch goes off. So I thought it might be a little bit more interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions, give my thoughts on, anything at all when we get to that portion. But I thought what would be a little bit more interesting to this group is to sort of see the history of politics and abortion as far as you can see it. Because actually I learned quite a bit going through that myself and preparing for today. Because as I was born in 1983. Abortion and politics has always gone hand in hand with me. I don't know another way. But then I was sitting there thinking about, I've seen the black and white video of, John Kennedy debating Nixon, and they didn't talk about abortion. In any of these writings of folks in the 50s and even the 60s, I mean, you could find something, but nothing that you could just point to and say, oh, that's that famous quote from the 60s from so-and-so about abortion. So some of the more interesting stuff that I found is one that before the 1973 ruling of Roe versus Wade, you got to imagine things like today, with the GLBTQ rights. Before the Supreme Court's ruling last year, what did we have? Well, we had states across the country who had their own laws about it, and abortion was kind of the same way. In fact, there were at least 20 states that before 1973 that had legalized abortion in some form or manner, and it took the same shape that we see it argued today, either just available upon request, or in the cases of incest, in the cases of rape. But I found that interesting. But we still had 3 presidents, either at the time of Roe versus Wade or after, that you don't really attribute much on the topic about, and that was Nixon, Ford, and Carter. In fact, they really stayed away from the topic altogether. It's just such a vast difference in politics than you see today. It's like a number one question, Somebody mentioned Congresswoman Walorski. She runs on abortion every year. That's one of her big issues. Nixon, in fact, directed his aides to keep completely out of the case. He didn't want to go on record about it. His only feelings we found out about abortion was when all his his tape recordings were released, and his private conversations about it. But I found that really interesting, and he won re-election with the majority of the Catholic vote, but he wanted to stay out of it. Gerald Ford was the same way. You didn't hear him say much about it. However, his wife, Betty Ford, was a huge advocate. She was a huge abortion advocate at the time. Some of the research that I found showed that between 1972 and 1980, there was virtually no correlation between a voter's views on abortion and their political party affiliation. Quite different. Only 30-some years later, here we stand today, that we see those sort of the contrast. The waters get muddy here and there, but we can say if somebody's a Republican, we likely know how they feel about it. If someone's a Democrat, we likely know how they feel about it. In fact, so if you think about it, back then you could have been a strong pro-choice, a long record of pro-choice legislation as a Republican and being reelected without a problem. In fact, what I found was that Ronald Reagan himself, when he was governor of California, he passed some of the most permissive laws that the country had at the time for abortion. However, it was really his 1986 State of the Union address where he took a hard right and he took a hard stand on being anti-abortion and really pushing the issue. And in fact, it wasn't even until the 80s that each political party put a plank in their platform regarding abortion. So up until the 80s, up until the time I was born, and a lot of us maybe were born and coming of age, this really wasn't a political issue. And we've seen it sort of gain the steam that it has, and here we are today. And I was laughing with Professor Tidmarsh. I said, politics and law, we go hand in hand. I hope I don't overlap too much on what you were saying, because he's the expert and I'm not. But some of the stuff I found in just the past 4 years, actually between the year 2010 and 2014 alone, at least 231 laws were passed in this country regarding abortion, regarding something that the Supreme Court has already ruled on. 231 laws, and the year 2010 is sort of relevant because that was the year, folks, this is not working. It was in 2010 when you saw a Republican wave, right, at the state and local levels. We still had Barack Obama as president. We still had the Democratic Party still controlled the majority in the Senate. They lost the majority in the House of Representatives. But what was really profound was what happened in states like Indiana, where you had a massive sweeping of Republicans winning seats at the local level. And that had a lot of policy implications. And one of them was definitely the introduction of the type of laws that we're seeing now, which we call the TRAP laws, right? Targeted regulation at abortion providers. Sort of was a new strategy at the time, and they were able to do that. It didn't matter what the federal level was doing. They were able to come in with these state laws and enact whatever sort of regulations that they wanted. In fact, so what's relevant is we saw that right here in our own community last year at the county level. We saw an ordinance brought forth that was just like the one in Texas that was held up by the Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which would have required abortion providers to have admitting privileges and meet all kinds of other standards that other hospitals and outpatient facilities, actually not even outpatient facilities, but mainly hospitals had to meet. We saw that here at the county level, and that's part of what this was. It was part of an agenda of that. It was defeated here at the local level on a party line vote, 3 Republicans to 6 Democrats, and that was the end of it. But more interestingly, at about the same time so you got the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Texas, which upheld that law in Texas. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where we live right now, the same sort of law was enacted in Wisconsin, and the Seventh Circuit of Appeals struck it down as unconstitutional. So what that means is, frankly, counties like ours can, at this moment, no longer enact those type of laws, although there's always some moving around and fudging that you can do with the law. And in fact, they could really pass the laws, and it would be up to someone to come and sue them and say, hey, this is unconstitutional for it to happen. But it was still kind of a big victory for the Democrats here, because not only did they vote against it for all the reasons that they did, but they got to say, hey, look, if we would have done this, we would have been struck down anyway. So that was kind of a big thing. So I think everybody's really watching what the Supreme Court's going to do with that Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I don't even understand the circuit courts myself. I'll have to sit down with Professor Tidmarsh and have him explain them to me. I just know we're in the 7th, and I know we're not in the 5th. So basically what we'll see this year, like the professor said, is the Supreme Court will rule on exactly how far the courts can go, or the states can go, on regulating abortion, like we've seen on so many other issues, including the gay marriage issue. And in fact, that's sort of, not to get off topic, but now that's what you see. You're going to see that being debated here in the Indiana State House, even though we just saw the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage is legal. Now you come in with the legalese and you decide, well, let's see where we can pick this apart, and who can say no and who can say yes, and and that's sort of where we're going to be moving into the future. The other thing that I wanted to mention here in my little portion of this is something that I found kind of fascinating is not so much the polling of what people call, and Professor Ladinsky has heard me kind of rant about this quite a bit, but we have an obsession with labeling, right, in our country. Politicians, it's no different. You're pro-choice, you're pro-life, that's it. You're pro-death penalty, you're anti-death penalty. The attitudes, though, regarding abortion are shifting. So what was interesting is polls have been done that basically show that Americans calling themselves pro-life is becoming the new normal. And what they mean by that is that they've run polls where they haven't asked somebody, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? Instead, they've asked them questions on how they feel about the issue. And I want to make sure I get this right because it's fascinating. 7 out of 10 Americans, basically in the answering of their questions, describe themselves as pro-choice. But then 2/3 of those same people ended up describing themselves as pro-life. And then in that same poll, 56% of them were in favor of legal access to abortions. So really, what does that mean? It means the labels are becoming pointless. It means I'm calling myself pro-life because that's just what we do, right? We're pro-life. But when you start peeling back the layers of the onion, what does it even mean to be pro-life now? What does it mean to be pro-choice? And that's the future of where I think the political conversation needs to go. And I've got lots of opinions on how that's possible, or whether that's possible, and how it can be done. But frankly, my overall opinion of it is our future is moving away from the labels of pro-life and pro-choice, and that's something that I've sat down and discussed many times, especially after we, that ordinance in the county here was struck down last year. I said, all right, maybe it's time to now step back and say, let's find some common ground. Let's see where we agree on the issue so that we can see this not continue to come up in our community, but we have to be willing to shed those labels. I mean, I've talked to people throughout that entire, I've talked to fellow Democrats. I'd say, so would you say you're pro-life or pro-choice? They'd say, well, I'm pro-life. So then I'd start drilling down, well, what about this? What about this? Well, yeah, I guess I'm fine with that. I guess I'm fine with that. Well, why do you call yourself pro-life? I don't know. I mean, that's just the culture where we're really gone to. So I think that's where the future of politics needs to go. I don't know how successful we'll be with that, but what does it actually mean to be pro-life? What does it actually mean to be pro-choice? And how does that fit into our current laws?
Oh, good. Well, I'm going to sit. So I always like to put myself in context before I speak. But number one, I'm 68 years old. I think all this matters, by the way. That's the reason I say it. And I'm an absolute, total, complete, and utter Christian. I also believe in the separation of church and state, and I feel very strongly about that. And I think that being born right after World War I, being raised in the Midwest, and being raised in a very solid working class family all shaped me. And I think as we talk, that makes a difference. When I say, what I mean by a solid working class family, that means I always had resources. I always had options. And that matters. And I think that that's part of what we need to pay attention to, options. So I'm going to start off by just saying that I actually worked for Planned Parenthood of North Central Indiana. And it's been so long ago, I couldn't quite remember the years, so about a year. So it's like 1980 to 81, before Betty Mooney. And Planned Parenthood, the main headquarters, used to be located on Chapin Street, on the corner of kind of Chapin and Washington. And that's where I worked. And I was the counseling and volunteer coordinator. So Planned Parenthood, and I don't know if it's the same now, but it used to be Planned Parenthood of North Central Indiana. We had offices in South Bend, Elkhart, Warsaw, and Plymouth. So I have to tell you, I had to go to all the offices. And so I was fine going to Elkhart, but I was a little nervous going to Warsaw and Plymouth back in those days. I really was. I'd really never gone to those communities. I drove through them, 31 going to Indianapolis. And so I was a little nervous going to Warsaw and Plymouth and spending time, and especially working for Planned Parenthood. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So anyway, Planned Parenthood of North Central Indiana, we never had an abortion clinic. However, we certified abortion clinics. So I, as a counseling director, when we went to different abortion clinics, I would look at their records and make sure that they were counseling women on their options and all the records were intact and that kind of thing. And then the nurse practitioner would do her part, and different ones of us would make sure that everything was up to snuff. I think I did at least 2, maybe 3. I can't remember anymore. So I want to talk about a couple of cases that stand out for me when I worked for Planned Parenthood that I still think about today. So one was a couple, an engaged couple at 2 of our very pristine colleges here. And they were about to graduate. They were going to be graduating that summer. They came from very upper class backgrounds, and they were going to get married. And he already had a job at a big firm. So they had it made. They already had it made. They had it made. Well, she was pregnant, and they elected to have an abortion. Now, again, I told you who I was. I couldn't figure that out, but I was very professional and cool. I was very, I handled it well. But inside I was going, you're already wealthy. You're going to stay wealthy, become wealthier. You're going to get married. You're pregnant. You're going to have an abortion. Well, because being pregnant at her wedding, and not maybe having the baby 7 months later, for her socioeconomic class, it just couldn't happen. And they were hysterical, and they had an abortion. I'll never forget that case. Another person that I had, a young woman who again was from a very nice community college here in town, upper class from a northwest small town like Oregon. She was pregnant, and her father was the mayor of the town, and she could not bring that shame, even the thought of telling her parents that she was pregnant. I mean, she sobbed and cried, and she had an abortion. You know, I just remember those kinds of things. So again, we're talking about resources. I also remember going to Warsaw, and a young woman, again, Warsaw, I was like, I'm going to Warsaw, you know? And I have to tell you, they were wonderful to me, treated me well. I had no problems at all. No one, raised their eyebrows or what are you doing here, none of that. And this woman was a victim of domestic violence, and so I regularly saw her. And the other person I saw was, and by the way, the first three were white, and then I saw a young black female here in South Bend. And she had been sexually active for a number of years, and now she was pregnant. And she was sobbing, and she didn't think she could have children because she had had sex for years and years. She had never gotten pregnant. So I was trying to talk to her about using birth control. She said, well, I didn't think I could have children. I've had sex. And anyway, she was now pregnant, and she elected to have her child. So just those cases have always stuck with me. I still think about them. So I want to talk about the black community in particular. You might have noticed I'm black. It's all over me. It's not a suntan. And so as I'm talking, I also want you to keep in mind socioeconomic class. Socioeconomic class matters. And so I'm talking from the perspective of a 68-year-old female who grew up in a working class, very solid working class family, and I think that makes a difference. So number one, we don't like to talk about messy things anymore. I've noticed that. In the 60s, we loved talking about messy things, The mess, it couldn't be messier. Now, and I'm very conscious. I pay attention. I notice when I'm in a group and people withdraw from me because I'm always speaking the truth and they don't want to hear it. And I don't quite understand that. But anyway, so in slavery, black women were raped and children were born. And then, when slave trafficking got to be like not so good, so the people came up with the idea of breeding. So we bred our own slaves. Again, black women being forced to have sex and forced to have babies. And so my point is that, so in the black community, having a child out of wedlock is not, oh my God, it just isn't that way. And also raising a child without a father, So we're not so, this is just my experience, we're not so traumatized when a woman, a young girl or a woman has a child out of wedlock in the black community. It's like, oh, put another cup of soup in the water in the soup, And, my Aunt Tildy, they couldn't have children, so they helped with the child. We just kind of always raised the children. And also remember, black women's children were sold away. And so they just love the other person's children. So we're kind of still like that. I don't think I'm wrong here. Young people will tell me, I'm sure. The other thing is that black people are very religious. And it doesn't matter whether you go to church or not. Because some neighbor or grandmother or aunts, you're just going to be religious. It's rare that a black person isn't exposed to religion. And that doesn't shape our lives. And I think that has a lot to do with abortions and birth control and all this kind of thing. Also, with that background, the only way a black woman had any respect in this country was she had to be very pious. Keep your legs closed. My mother, oh my God. I mean, if my sister and I, if we were somewhere and our knees didn't touch, I could feel my mother looking at me, But that whole thing about being pious, that was the only way a black woman got any respect from anybody in this country. I'm not so sure it's that true today. The other thing is, we're a very patriarchal community. We talk about the black mother and all that kind of thing. That's true. But don't think we're not patriarchal. It's the woman's responsibility to take care of the men. And if a woman gets pregnant, it's her fault. If a man hits on you, it's your fault. Your cleavage was too low, you hugged him, you looked at him, you laughed. You know, I have to tell this. My sister, who was very voluptuous, by the way, used to drink her water, and when she drank it, she probably saw it on television. Elizabeth Taylor probably did it, because she loved Elizabeth Taylor. And she'd put her little finger up. My mother was hysterical. She put her finger up. She was enticing some man. I mean, I'm telling you, this is how we were raised. So it was our responsibility to make sure that nobody, a man, tried to, and if we got pregnant, well, that was our fault. The other thing is that in our community, why would we go to Planned Parenthood or anything? We don't trust white people. Why should we? You know the Tuskegee experiment. You know all the things that have been done in the name of progress and science and whatever else to black people. So going to health clinics, we're nervous about that. We still are, but for good reason. I talk about being poor. So being poor doesn't mean if you talk about blacks and poverty, if you're talking about poverty and race, you're talking about black people. So we're used to being poor. That doesn't mean we aspire to being poor. That doesn't mean we like being poor. But that is the condition of a majority of black people in this country, and it still is. I would like to say that people without options want to have something of their own. I can't tell you the number of young black women who have said to me, well, I'm gonna have this baby because I want something of my own, something that will love me. And that shows a little bit about how young black women feel, in our society, to have something of your own. I also think, again, going back to class, that if you don't have options, then having sex is a pretty good one. It feels good. Can I have a witness? Okay. It feels good, and you get immediate gratification. So if you just think about being poor and being not supervised, or people working and older cousins kind of looking after people, I think that's all part of poverty. I do think that, I'm sure that upper class black people and upper middle class black people have many of the same options, that white people have, except that there's a disproportionate number of black people in poverty. And that's just the way it is. So, so later on we're going to talking about moving the conversation forward. But those are the kinds of things that I wanted to share, that I think that I could bring to the table that maybe other panelists can't. I also want to say that, the truth is that I wouldn't admit it if I had. So I'm just going to put that out. I'm not all saintly at all. So I've never had an abortion. And like I said, if I had, I wouldn't have admitted it, but I can say I never have. But I'll have to say that, I got married right out of high school, not unusual in my day. I was divorced by the time I was 30. I had 2 children. And of course, being in the socioeconomic class that I was in, I had options to go to healthcare facilities. I had doctors. I could get on birth control. All the newest ones that came in. And if I was pregnant and I decided that I didn't want to carry the birth deficient, I had the means to have an abortion. I mean, I did have the options. And I just think we don't pay enough attention to that. And like I said, I'm sure other communities also, but I'm talking about black people specifically. And I just think we need to think about that. The other thing is that the whole thing about, and I know we're talking about abortion, but again, I work for Planned Parenthood, and I know that most of the time at Planned Parenthood, I wasn't talking about abortion, and people weren't pregnant. I was talking about health care. We were talking about getting mammograms. We were talking about getting your immunizations. We really did, and I think still, we really were a healthcare facility for people. And I just think that that gets so lost in this hysteria about abortion. That Planned Parenthood provides good, solid, accessible health care for especially lower-class women, but any women. I hired the first male at Planned Parenthood, and he was the son of a local gynecologist, but I thought, you know, women don't get pregnant by themselves. We need to have, I know it's a shock. But I hired a young man who worked at Planned Parenthood. The other thing is that when my daughter and her friends started coming over, well, my daughter, of course, was there already, I talked to them about, you see, there's this myth that only good girls get pregnant. Have you ever heard that? Because if you're a good girl, you're not on birth control because, of course, you're not going to have sex. So if you're out and you're with a boy and things feel good and it gets heated and you have sex, well, good girls get pregnant. Where these bad girls, these whores, these hussies, you know, they're on birth control. They have condoms. They're prepared to have sex. So again, if you go back to the black community and how black women have been reared, if you're a good girl, if you're a Christian girl, if you're a pious girl, of course you don't have birth control. Well, I wanted my 14, 15, 16, 17, 25-year-old, forget the pious stuff. I wanted her to protect herself. And I said to her and her friends, if you are going, that you can go out and you can get pregnant and it doesn't even necessarily feel good. The first couple of times we know it doesn't, right? For most of us. But I encouraged my daughter to go to Planned Parenthood. I said, you don't have to tell me, but I want you to be protected, and I want you to, if you want to get pregnant, I want you to get pregnant when you want to be pregnant. And if you want to have children, I want you to have children because you want to have children. And I encouraged my daughter. And what I didn't know till 10 years later, she's 50 now, so it doesn't matter. She went right out and went to Planned Parenthood. And I'm like, you know, it's exactly what I wanted her to do. So these are the conversations that I think we don't have in our homes, we don't have in our churches, we don't have in our community centers. And I just think that we need to have more of this kind of thing and include young males too. So I'm going to pass it to Michael.
Well, again, I'm Cynthia Murphy, and I think it's fascinating how all of the speakers are melding. I'm going to take a little bit more personal choice, so to talk more personally, because I had two thoughts when Dr. Ladinsky asked me to sit on the panel. My first thought was, oh my God, I don't know if I should do this. But many of you know Dr. Ladinsky. I don't think any woman in her right mind says no to Dr. April, and because she's such a force for good in Michiana, so I couldn't say no. I wanted to. And my second thought was, darn it, I should do this. And I know I should do this because of the work that I do in the Latino community. But I have to be really honest. In this case, on this issue in the Latino community, I am the outsider. I am the other. In the work that I do with students, we do not sit around and talk about pro-choice and pro-life. We do talk about Donald Trump a lot, but we don't talk about this. And I think that when people are having sex, I don't think there's a lot of talk going on when people are having sex. So I used to say to my students, and I still do, people probably really shouldn't be having sex until they can say the word penis and vagina without giggling, until they can talk to their partner about things like birth control and contraception and STDs. But if you're too embarrassed to do that and you're letting somebody else's body part inside of yours, I think we have a problem. So I think I should be here because with the majority of Latinos, probably 90%, they're Catholic. And so with the doctrines of the Catholic Church and the teachings of our very popular new Pope, it's pretty clear where most Latinos publicly have to stand on this issue. So I did tell the Latino Student Union Executive Board that I would be here. I said, you know, I wanted you to hear this from me first. Unfortunately, I was a little late because it had already started circling. And I said, I wanted you to know that I would be here. You're welcome to come. I understand if you don't, and there's probably a myriad of reasons why I don't see any Latinos here in this room. That could be one of them. And I said, and if you haven't guessed by now, I'm pro-choice, and I need you guys to know that. They probably already did, but so as I was thinking in this whole couple weeks, I thought, you know, I love, admire, respect working with Latinos and working with them in their community around issues. So I should reflect a little bit on why am I pro-choice? I mean, we should kind of understand why we believe the things that we do. And it's important for people to know that. And so I started thinking, well, okay, I was born in December in the last month of 1961. So the last month of the last year that most people technically considered the baby boom issue. So I'm a little bit younger than Charlotte, not as young as Jason. So I'm kind of this middle perspective. And so I started thinking about, in my mind, a history of choice or history of lack of choice. So I picked out some key issues that I remember thinking about when I was growing up. Not because, again, I'm definitely not an expert. We don't talk about this in Indiana a lot. You know, we don't talk about religion and politics at the table, God forbid, you know, things like that. We don't talk about sex. But I started thinking about the things that because I was a conscious, living, breathing human being, well, I kind of noticed these things. So this is my brief timeline. Don't let me go over, Dr. April. But, you know, 1920, women earned the right to vote, okay? For the first time, there was choice. We could potentially see that we had choice in how our government was going to run, how we were going to make laws. What would have happened if we were never offered that choice, okay? But I should say the right to vote comes with the option to exercise it, okay? And that is something we're not very good at doing in Indiana. And also because we have the right to vote doesn't mean that laws don't get passed that negatively impact us and take away our choice. So like, for example, from 1873 to 1938, that was the era of the Comstock laws. So if a woman's like, well, I don't want to get pregnant and I want to have a choice and I'd like to use birth control. There was no advertising. If you somehow found out information about birth control and you had it sent to you in the mail in a brown paper wrapping, if your mail carrier suspected that maybe there was something in there, your mail could be confiscated. No choice, right? So finally, in 1972, I was in 4th grade, birth control was legalized regardless of your marital status. Because as far back as 1965, in 26 states, unmarried women were prohibited from getting birth control, okay? And then my favorite that I remember thinking about, in 1975, of course, rape, any non-consensual sexual intercourse between non-spouses, that's always been illegal. It still happened. But however, until 1975, every state had a marital exception. And I remember being infuriated that a husband could rape his wife without any legal consequences. I was a freshman in high school. So now my next key date was 1979 when, and I put here, so to make it more official, Cynthia writes letter to the 9 justices on the Supreme Court admonishing the court that 9 men did not have the right to determine what a woman does with her body. Okay? Can I get an amen for that? Amen. All right. I'm not sure what they did with the letter, and that's the only line I remember. But then I still think, even in spite of Roe v. Wade passing, in spite of the fact that we have birth control, when I went back to college, because by then I was married, had 2 children, divorced, and didn't have a viable source of income. And it's really hard. I don't know if there are any other single moms, and I get emotional, who are trying to go to college and raise young children. I think mine were 3 and 18 months at the time. It is really, really, really hard. Very worth it, but really hard. And I see young women do this all the time. And so one day I just said, I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm going to look up the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families TANF benefits. And I'm going to see if, please God, can I just go to school and finish this so that I can have the opportunity to give my daughters a better life. In 1989, approximately, and I looked it up, the TANF benefit, not counting food stamps, not counting Medicaid, for a single woman with 2 children was $279. Cash benefits to put gas in my car, to pay rent, and I'm like, well, I guess I'll keep working and going to school and never seeing my children, which was basically what that amounted to. And I thought, well, I think maybe I'm wrong on this number. When you get older, you're like, oh, Shirley, my memory is going, and that's not right. So I looked up, and in 2012, the TANF benefit for a single woman with 2 children is $377 a month. So I'm thinking, I'm not as forgetful as I think I am. And so then we come to the present day where, we have choice now. Legalized choice, but 1 in 3 women still are victims of intimate domestic partner violence. Still, women are underrepresented, even in 2014, in medical research about things that could improve our reproductive choices or healthcare options. And I could cite so many more examples, even in an era when we have an unprecedented amount of choice, how our choice so easily can be taken away from us. And that is why I should be here today, so that any Latina who's not here or any young woman anywhere knows that there can be some safe spaces where we can talk about really difficult things. And I've had an interesting life. In my life's working with the Latino community, I've done that for about a quarter of a century, maybe more. I've kind of lost track. I have translated for a couple as they were contemplating and undergoing in vitro fertility treatments. So that's kind of a weird place to be. I've also translated in the initial consultations for abortion services for a young pregnant Latina woman and her mother, and they just knew that she couldn't be pregnant at this time. I've spent time at the Women's Pavilion. I used to go to Planned Parenthood for low-cost birth control. I've had friends who have made the difficult decision to have an abortion, and I know it's never easy. I have friends who, like myself, when I found that I was pregnant and I realized, man, I didn't marry the right person to be pregnant with. This guy was, Trisha Yearwood says, a walk-away Joe. There was no way this person was ever going to be around to raise our children. And so I struggled. I called the clinic. I went and visited. I personally couldn't make that choice. And I know in the Latino community, that's a really hard choice, although I do know that Latinas get abortions at same, if not higher rates than just the general populace. I know how hard of a decision it is, because in the Latino community, children are blessings. It's almost mandated from the Pope. Go forth, procreate, okay? So I've been there, I've had to think, I've had to decide, I've had to wrestle, and I love my children. I'm happy I have them. I'm also a nana, a grandma. So I've never questioned or judged the choices that any other woman has had to make because it's difficult and it's personal. But more importantly, I don't want to live in a world where women can't make choices for themselves. So the last thing that I want to say, and I brought it with me, a friend of mine who could not be here today, and since there's no Latinos in the room, there might be some Catholics, so I hope not to offend, but I'll read it here. It says, María fue consultada para ser Madre de Dios. So Maria, even the Virgin Mary, was consulted and could have said yes or no to having Jesus, God, in the human flesh. Elegir es derecho de todos. To choose is all of our rights. Having choices is all of our rights. So, maternidad libre, the freedom to become a mother. Maternidad voluntaria. It's a voluntary choice. It should be a voluntary choice to become a mother because children are our most precious resources in our future. So thank you.
So this just was beautiful. Thank you so much, all of you. I was remiss in not mentioning that this is being recorded, so thank you, Joe Haas, for producing this. So if you have friends who were not able to come today, or you would like to look at this again or share it, well, you'll be able to do that through, we'll post a link in the event site. And also, if you haven't yet checked out the best YouTube station ever, Women's and Gender Studies at IUSB, write that down. We'll be posting that there as well. So we have a little bit of time to talk, to ask questions of our panelists. We'll make sure that folks get out of here by 2:30, but lots of overlapping and interesting ideas. So I've got a microphone, so if you have a question, I'm gonna run out to you so that we'll be able to catch you on for our video recording. So questions or comments for our panelists? So. Okay, well, you're not going to be recorded, but. Unless they need it for the recording. Yes, they do. So, there you go.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Harry. I'm a professor at the business school here. And I've done quite a bit of work in diversity, and I'm working with April on something, actually, as we speak. There's a thought that came to my mind that sort of combines some of what Jason and Charlotte said about moving the conversation forward and trying to find some common ground between the two camps, if you will. I'm thinking that what we can do at the community level is with love and understanding and as little bias as possible, is try to offer wisdom to these young ladies so that they are really truly making the right decision, whichever way it goes. And also, that may be a way that we can approach the other side, right, the pro-life side. Because, you know, one of their arguments, the way I understand it at least, is life is life and you should protect it at all times, and women have abortions for all the wrong reasons, or a lot of times have abortions for the wrong reasons. And I don't know, if we're going to be honest with ourselves and try to find a common ground, we have to face the prospect that perhaps some abortions are had. They are done for the wrong reasons. And so that's sort of my thought is, how do we, as a community, come to grasp with that notion of providing support that's real, that's heartfelt, so that people can make these life-changing decisions.
So anybody on the panel want to comment or respond to that?
Well, I guess my one comment is that in the Black community, you know, you know, if a woman gets pregnant and she's not married, she's a whore. I mean, she's loose. It's negative, and so, you know. So I guess it would be wonderful to have that kind of a conversation. And so who's going to help? So, you know, so I mean that's it. I mean that's the
Well, there's two things that I think of, is that, again, their silence leads to the inability to look at all options and to even think clearly. If you are being yelled and screamed at in front of a abortion clinic, there's these kind of difficult conversations where people can't talk to their parents, where they can't talk to a respected person, make situations like that happen, okay? And then, but the other thing I think is people working with young women, they definitely need wisdom, but young women who are facing pregnancy alone or even within the context of family resources, they need resources. If you are a foster parent, you get more than 307, I think you get at least that per child that you foster. So we have these huge inequities in our system where we say, first of all, we say to young women, it's your fault if you're pregnant, and still too often it's okay for the young man. Latino parents almost want to lock their daughters up, but they're not talking about locking up their sons, and it takes two people to get pregnant. So we have to have conversations, and then if people find themselves in this situation, there has to be resources. You can't turn around and then blame those welfare mothers for bilking the system and taking your hard-earned tax dollars. Wisdom and resources, and we have to break the silence.
Yeah, I think both of you are correct in that we have to have the conversations and we have to have the resources. And because abortion has been so stigmatized, what has happened in many offices, if somebody comes in and says, well, I'm thinking about having an abortion, they were immediately given a referral off to an abortion facility because people didn't want to talk about it, because they didn't want to be seen as being supportive of that as one of many options. And in fact, the law said that at Planned Parenthood, you could not really sit down and have a very lengthy conversation about abortion or pregnancy options. You had to give just the 3 options and referrals to agencies in town, but you really could not do the full diagnosis and counseling about pregnancy in the context of that woman's individual situation. The kind you're talking about and the kind that you talked about is you have resources and why are you deciding, or you have no resources and how are you deciding and what are you going to have. And in terms of foster kids, remember Senator Broden has been struggling to get adequate money promised by the legislature to support people who adopt children with special needs, and they're still on back order, I believe. So I think that if we are going to say that they are resources, then they can't just be promised. They really have to be there.
True.
So we have a couple other hands here. Did anybody want to
Well,
respond to that? Yeah.
I just wonder, again, we keep talking about having conversations, but we're not gonna have these conversations. I guess I'd even like to have us think about how do we have these, do we have in the public school? Well, then it's like, no, if you talk about sex, you're gonna have sex, which I think is ridiculous. But I mean, where do we even talk to young people about sex and sexuality and, and also I think, I want to just add one thing, there's a financial a part of, you're in the school business. I wish we'd talk about, do you know how much it costs to have children? You know what I mean? How expensive it is? So it just seems to me, it's just another one of the things that we don't want to talk about. So it's no wonder.
Yeah, so I actually am going to, I see there's a couple hands on both sides here, but I want Cynthia to say just a little bit about this idea you have as we think about, Jason very helpfully, those statistics really remind us, and so did Harry's comment, this is complicated. It's when we talk about this in bifurcated ways, we dumb it down for all of us. And so knowing that people on, quote unquote, both sides are actually really taking a more nuanced view is something we can keep in mind. And creating spaces that are beyond, I think we're probably preaching to the choir here, but hopefully we'll leave with some incentives to not just talk with people who agree with you already, but some skills for talking about those who might have different kinds of perspectives. And I thought Cynthia had some good ideas about what that could look like in the community, and I think we're going to continue to talk about that for a few more minutes. But if you would share that idea, that would be great.
Well, I am from, most recently, Goshen. I grew up in Napanee. So one of my friends and colleagues who works at Goshen College, a Peace Church, has had a similar model, only for her, it came down to, at Goshen College, they are anti-war, and, at times it has been perceived that that means a disrespect for military families. And so Carolyn Schrock-Schenk, at the time, sat down with a woman who had lost her child in one of the wars, and the two of them together had very intimate and difficult conversations around these huge pro-choice, pro-life issues. And I think that that's a model that we need to think through. I personally, know many students who are pro-life. I'm pro-choice, and what are the avenues where we could sit down together and hear each other's stories, or hear, like Dr. Harry, maybe that wasn't the right, we have to be willing to share hard and difficult things together, but I think that some of that has to happen outside of that public light, because sound bites and the public light on the issue can really entrench people's thoughts. So in getting together in small groups and having real
The idea of a house party, sort of, or a house conversation in private spaces, I think,
to
really.
welcome the
yeah.
other in your
Yeah.
home as another human being.
Yeah,
So
I think it's a beautiful and doable idea. So, there's a couple questions over here.
Well, first of all, just, thank you guys for having the panel. This is a really good conversation to be having. So, much, kudos to you guys. And I think kind of to speak to this guy's statement, and also to, the dynamic of what's happening around the abortion of a life, is the honesty or humility involved in saying that there are no correct choices, there are only informed choices. And that's the thing that we're really trying to strive for. And if we're going to be pro-choice, we should be about creating more choices for either decision. And so, yeah, with regard to, having these panels or groups of people that can consult a mother who may be considering abortion, I think is very key. You have to have some information in order to make a decision, right? That's really what I would think pro-choice would be all about. But I wanted to speak directly about what Charlotte was talking about. And back in the slavery era, and even on the plantation era, and even at present day, one of the things that black mothers would be willing to do was to sacrifice the life of their child so that the child wouldn't actually experience the woes of slavery, the woes of plantation life. And even in our modern era, one of the major facets, especially in my high school years, I'm same age as Jason, so those are long gone now. Just had to have a moment of silence for that. But yeah, one of the major driving forces behind the African American community is not just this, you're a skeezer if you're getting pregnant, but there's also, I don't want to sacrifice or expose the child that I might have to the ills of this society. So I guess I want to, speak to what Charlotte said, but I also wonder if Jason might chime in on what the campaigning is like to provide that resource bank so that we aren't living off of this reactionary existence, right? Where we're taking abortions because we're reacting to the society that we live in. Like, I don't want to have a child right now because they're killing black babies. I don't want to have a child right now because they're imprisoning all of these black males. I don't want to have a black baby because I don't want my little girl to turn up pregnant like I was at 16. So what efforts are we doing inside of this pro-life democratic lane? And Charlotte, if you can speak to what we can do to come out of this reactionary space that we're in, so that we can start to consider the birth of a child as as a tool by which we can further the objective of the African American community, but also other communities in the broader sense. Does that make sense? Cool. Head nods. Cool. You got me?
I thought you brought up an interesting sort of theory, right, about the abortion rates in general with the black population, and I don't know about that, but I do. The only thing I was going to mention is I know the suicide rates among black males and females is low. Typically, it's very low, and one of the prevailing theories is black folks have it rough in this country. Like they're not the ones killing themselves over silly things. It's more the white people are doing it. I mean, I don't know. You can get more heady into that. So that actually fascinates me a little bit. I don't know if there's anything to that. I'd be really interested in hearing that. As far as the political aspects go, the big problem with abortion as an issue is, one, it's so emotional. I mean, the religion, this is the most emotional issue there probably is. But the real problem, I mean, I don't think the politicians are going to do it, frankly. And that's not what I'm probably supposed to say, but I think it's community groups and organizations and maybe party leaders that can start driving that conversation. But politics, as far as campaigning and representing, it's so defensive. It's a constant game of defense, because I say one thing, I say one sentence, and my opponent just blasts me for that, puts millions of dollars of Koch brothers money behind it, and I mean, there's a constant fear of that. And so I don't know if the politicians are going to get it done, but the big problem with the issue of abortion is there hasn't been one side that's lost yet, and there's one side that's won. And we could debate about it and argue about it, but I feel like you almost have to at a certain point before you can start finding that common ground. Of the Affordable Health Care Act, for example, Republicans lost, Democrats won. Now, the Republicans keep trying to overturn it, but that's just political. We all know that's just a game. We know Barack Obama's not going to, of course he's going to veto. It's his, it's named after him. But they lost. I mean, so at a certain point, then you did start having lawmakers coming together and saying, okay, how can we start fine-tuning this? They got rid of the medical device tax, because there was a clear winner and there was a clear loser. I feel like we haven't even gotten there yet on this 40-year-old issue yet, and we need to. I feel like people that are, pro-life or whatever you want to call it, I feel like, they're going to have to get with the program. This has been the law now for 40 years. It's not going back. And then I think the pro-choice side needs the security in knowing that it won't. And I don't think either side has gotten that before they can, any politicians anyway, are actually going to sit down and start. I think it's entirely community. I think it's entirely local. I don't think you're going to see a politician carrying the banner for it and getting it done, not the way that it needs to be. I think it's groups like this that's where it's at. I don't know if Charlotte has.
I agree. So we have several hands here. I want to, do people want to, why don't you kind of put your hands up if you're willing to hang out for about 5 more minutes? Are we, okay. I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I also appreciate that people are taking time out of their Saturday. So why don't you get Dr. Mischler over there, and we'll get a couple folks this way, and maybe let's try to keep it brief. Then afterwards, folks can talk to the panelists a little bit more and also talk to Lynn Coleman. So.
All right, so Charlotte and I are of the same generation, and we seem to be the generation that has no problem saying things that are uncomfortable for people. Everybody else seems to be wanting to make peace, and that's not the way I grew up. Making peace meant giving up. And my heroes when I was growing up were people who did not make peace but caused trouble. So in that spirit, I have 2 things to say that have not been mentioned. One is, to sort of add on to what Charlotte was saying, I think it's really important to understand the role of race in this debate. And it's interesting when the 14th Amendment was put up, that it's interesting that the strongest opponents of abortion are also the strongest opponents of the 14th Amendment applied to African Americans. And in some ways, the strongest geographical opposition to abortion rights are in the areas which were the seats of the old Confederacy. So that in some ways that there's a way of seeing a historical conservative trend that is not, it's not that race or gender is more important, opposes the rights of all people, regardless of their group. And that's why I'm a little bit more concerned about saying, you know, let's all get together when you, if we don't recognize that the people who oppose abortion rights oppose rights. They oppose labor, they oppose black people, they oppose immigrants, they oppose women, they oppose LGBT people. And so these are not separate issues. And I think that we have to see abortion rights as within that in thinking politically. Because, you know, it's not going to, you know, if we find one or two people, and I know they're here. I know there are what are called seamless web Catholics, and they agree with progressives on most things except for abortion, but they're a very small group. You know, they're not representative of the entire church, which brings to the other uncomfortable question, which is the political role of the Catholic Church in making this. This is not a political issue that became an issue by itself. As the speaker said, Ronald Reagan, you know, who's the, you know, he's the god of the conservatives. He wasn't particularly concerned about this. So why did it become an issue? Why did the Catholic Church take the issue as a way of positioning themselves politically on the right? Because during the 1960s, that was much more a debate within the Catholic Church. This issue put them in alliance with their traditional enemies, which were the evangelical white Protestants, who for most of the history in this country hated Catholics. And how did the Catholic Church make peace with that political bloc? They found a common ground around abortion rights. So I'm not sure it's so easy to find, you know, once you can do it person to person, and that's fine, but if you're talking about institutions, these institutions are against us. And if we forget that, as he says, people win and lose in this world. And I think that most of us would not like to be on the losing end so much.
Any responses to Dr. Fishler? Okay, well, let's hear maybe.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Eli, and I'm active with the organization Pro-Choice South Bend. And we're trying just to create a culture of activism in this community, and we're rapidly evolving, and we're looking for the revolution. So I would respectfully disagree that it's older generations, because I think some of the most radical activism is emerging from young people. So like I said, we're just creating a culture of activism, and I wanted to put one quick plug. We'll have an email list back there, and we have 2 Facebook pages. One's a group, and one's a page, and it's just under Pro-Choice South Bend. So my question is, and everyone touched on this, but I thought it might be good just to have a group discussion, is that how can we localize this conversation? We know the history, we know the laws, we know what's going on with the Supreme Court, and I really would argue that we're in a state of crisis with abortion care in this community. We've recently closed our clinic, and we have an incredibly active anti-choice community here that is, I think, protesting right now downtown. And our organization emerged from clinic defense volunteers, which basically means we're walking women, people with uteruses, their partners, to the door of the clinic while wearing bright yellow vests. And one of the most shocking things I heard while doing clinic defense is people shouting at black women, Black Lives Matter. So my question is just, how can we localize the conversation and deal with the crisis we're facing in South Bend and Michiana and northern Indiana?
And I think Cynthia's idea is one, those kinds of local conversations, but other.
First thing, I did have a response to these institutions. You know, if we could start with the basis that institutions serve institutions, they don't serve people. And people need to get together and serve people. If we're waiting on institutions to do it, we're going to be waiting a long time. And that's in higher ed and any type of institution that you can think of. Institutions get to a point where they are in service of themselves. So I probably should have asked that not be put on the recording, but.
I think politically, if you want to drive movement, and I'm trying to think of a way to say this to not sound bad, but I will. You have to make yourself consequential. Make me care. I mean, I'm with you anyway, so it's easy, but just in this, make me scared, make me worried. The Democratic Party here has a great relationship with organized labor. If something were to happen to that, I'd get scared because they give, they support candidates, there's a lot of them, they vote, they show up and knock doors, that's the important thing. They make phone calls, be consequential. I mean, it's not just getting around and talking about it when it comes to politics. That doesn't scare anyone. Sharing things on Facebook, that's the problem with our generation, right? We're getting lazy. And I see it firsthand. I'm the chairman of the Democratic Party here, and I mean, we get new people, and Charlotte knows, we're working on it. We've got new elected officials now of our generation, but it's slow and it's tough. Where is everybody? Everybody on Facebook had a lot to say about RFRA, right? Well, where were they? When we're standing in front of something and we're protesting it, or when we're making phone calls and we have, a candidate that supports rights versus a candidate who doesn't. Where are they at making phone calls for that candidate? You have to make yourself consequential. You have to show that you are a force to be reckoned with. You have to show that the other side should be scared of you, and that's how they get scared of you. That's how I'd be scared of you.
I guess I'm going to respectfully disagree. Sorry.
That's how I look at it.
I think that at some point we have to go outside of the box. Because like with the unions, we live in the state of Indiana. We know unions to me are very relevant, Dr. Mishler. But if you go out and you talk to people in Indiana, they're like, oh, no union, anti-union. I mean, the vast majority, we have the state with the lowest voting rate. So people who seem filled with hate and anger get out to vote. I don't know. So we have to change that, and we have to listen to new ideas from younger people. And I don't think maybe making people scared is going to move our objectives forward.
I don't mean people as in the populace. I mean your leaders in the opposition. That's what I mean is.
I still don't think it's going to work.
It's just my point being, if you're going to drive change, you actually have to drive it. Sitting around talking about it just doesn't do it. I mean, you have to support that change, and that's all I mean. And that could be a Republican, independent. Bernie Sanders right now. Look what's going on with his campaign. It's something completely different. But he's got people that are giving him money that have never given money to political campaigns before. He's got people that are making phone calls that have never done it before. And he's got a good shot at being the next president of the United States, even though it's from a completely and that's because people are getting out of their seats. They're doing it.
I think it's because social media. I think social media is incredibly powerful, and that's why Bernie Sanders' campaign is spreading, and that's how we publicize our meetings. So I think social media is great.
I'd like to, no, and social media is great for publicizing meetings, no doubt, but I mean, and I just had this conversation with a young kid who wants to run for state representative hereby, and he said, well, here's my budget, and I'm going to spend this much on Facebook ads, and it's the same conversation, they don't vote. I mean, it's not.
So we need to add a microphone, so let's pass it forward. And we're going to hear from 3 more people briefly, and then if you pass it forward, I'll pass it back. All right. This will be very so much. And then you
My name's Liam. I'm an executive officer of Pro-Choice South Bend, along with Noel Spring and Ali Kaluzny. And these are conversations we have in our meetings, like every single meeting. What is the best method to get people invested and engaged? And we recognize that the people who are part of being oppressed by the institutions, right, that keep us oppressed, are people who are working, are people who have kids, people who are being oppressed, and so they're busy, and the reasons that they aren't showing up to rallies or other things aren't because, that they're lazy or other things. It's because they're working to get food on the plate for the kids, or maybe they're just tired. So we are trying to engage very much our community in ways that are showing how abortion or how reproductive health care is really positive, and trying to have really, really positive conversations, at least right now, around health care. And I like the way that this is framed today because reproductive health care in our community beforehand has been good in some ways, not in others. But kind of addressing what you were talking about, I mean, the way that we counsel women at the pavilion, we tried to make sure that they were making decisions based on the moment that they were there, the best decision for that time. And if they came back later and they were struggling with that decision, we tried to connect them to resources. And this conversation here is about building on what we've already done well and learning what we could do better, and Pro-Choice South Bend is also learning to do that. We're going to be doing an art installation in the future, in the next month, and part of it is writing how abortion is a social good in our community. And so there are flags in the back. If you know someone who's had an abortion, or you've had an abortion, or you know of a way that abortion is a social good, please write that on one of those flags, and it will be featured in that art installation in the future. So keep an eye on that. And that is it.
I have one challenge that I'd like to say. You know, you're not going to convince a person who's pro-choice to be the other way, or, you know what I mean? We're not going to convince each other. I think we ought to change the narrative. I think we ought to take control and find the common ground. For instance, well, no matter what side you're on, do you really like someone telling you what to do? You know? I mean, I think you could get people really roused up about that. What about the American way of, I do what I damn well please. And if you don't like it, you don't have to da-da-da. Well, you know, I just think we ought to change the narrative and rally people up that kind of way. I think that would be much more fruitful.
Can I have something to say about that? And you used the language, and then you used a language that was interesting. You were talking about how unions are bad for people, and how the prevailing
people in Indiana.
People in Indiana are saying unions are bad. People in Indiana are saying pro-choice. People in Indiana are saying that college students are really investing in their own damn future, so the state has no business supporting public colleges. This language is not arising out of little focus groups of loving people. This language is being invented by people who are funded think tanks, by people like the Koch brothers. The Heritage Foundation didn't just arise out of a local neighborhood meeting at all. It was funded from the very start, just like the Tea Party was. And we need to recognize where this language comes from and who is oppressing us with the language and the money. The second thing I'm going to say, and this is really fast, we had a Supreme Court decision in 1954. We had a Roe v. Wade. We had all of these court decisions. And where is integration in America these days? Schools are as segregated as they ever were. Where is the financial support for poor black students? It ain't there. What you have to realize is that having passed the law, that's only the beginning. These people with the dough are going to start chipping away at that the way they've been chipping, so that we've got this, what's the word? There's two legal phrases. One of them is, pardon me? De facto. De facto and de jure, yeah. I mean, de jure, abortion is legal. De facto, every time you look around, there's some wealthy right-wing white guy chipping away. And it's the same. Charles is one of them. Charles is one, didn't David another one?
And if I could leave you with one thing, it's this, and the facts support this every time. When people come out to vote, the progressive ideal wins every single time. When it loses is because people didn't go out and vote. That is a fact. I mean, and polls support it everywhere now. The majority of people support the progressive side on things. And so what I mean, how many people in this room didn't vote in November of 2014? We had an election. I mean, I'm not trying to guilt you into it. And I know everybody's busy. Believe me, I got this job, and I got my real job, and then I got my family. You know, I get it. But why don't people, 14, 12%, one day, a half an hour, go out and vote? Come on. Nobody's that busy. You have to be motivated to do it. And that's what I mean by the social activism. I mean, you've got to go way beyond that. I mean, it's got to be way more in your face. The more, you know, you don't put money into Facebook ads when you're running a campaign because it doesn't translate into votes. And that's just a simple fact. It doesn't move the people. I mean, you have it as part of yours, you know, and stuff, but I mean, that's why I mean, to me, it's all local. It's here, you know, we've got a great candidate in Lynn Coleman. you know, and that's it. And I mean, that's where it starts, and it all has to center around that, and it has to be, you just gotta get out and do it. You gotta get off your butt, man.
And you know what? Activism is not just protesting only.
Right, that's what I mean.
Right?
No.
We're sitting at a university right now, and in this university, in Notre Dame, in these areas where we influence so many lives, we have to build alliances and be willing to be bold in what we do. You come to any of my classes, you're going to think it's a gender studies course, and I'm a business professor, and I walk the halls of the business
Thank you,
school.
Harry.
And people think I'm this sort of anarchist, feminist, crazy person, because if I have a chance in my business and society course to put people in front of gender issues, in front of race issues, I will do it every single time. I will pull students, and I do on a regular basis, and put them right in my house, and I feed them, and I start this conversation, and I have students who will come back years later and say, I'm a changed person because of all the uncomfortable things you've had. So I think
Literally.
we need to mobilize in academia, those of us who are involved in academia, to really believe that we do influence people's lives and do it in a more organized, collaborative manner.
Okay, so.
Feel free to come to any of our future meetings.
Yeah, wonderful. So, and I think, so we have one final comment by Stacy Ballantyne, a recent graduate of our program. And just I want to reiterate how important that is, what Jason said, that when people turn out to vote, progressive ideas win. That is very, very heartening. And I think, you know, if you're feeling depressed about the current landscape, that's a good story to tell other people as well. It's a good incentive for people who feel like their vote doesn't matter. And there's a great letter from the League of Women Voters presidents, the local and statewide president in the South Bend Tribune today about voter suppression in Indiana and ways that you can be active about that. So turning out the vote means that progressive ideas win. So Stacy, you've got the final word, and then we'll say just a quick moment about how to sign up for more information.
So in 1959, my grandmother sought an illegal abortion. She had 14 children at home, aged 9 months to 23. She was only 39 years old herself. She did not survive that. She lost her life. My mother was 15 years old and lost her mother. Most of her brothers and sisters were younger. No one has really addressed this here today, and I think it's something important to talk about, but this really is a matter of life and death for women in our community. So I didn't know if maybe someone could sort of speak to or offer some statistics regarding female mortality rates when access to safe and affordable reproductive health isn't available for women.
I don't know if anybody on the panel has that, or Dr. Stecker, do you?
What was the specifics? I think it's, you know,
Female mortality.
Abortion, but
It's not available.
when it's not available,
Yeah.
yeah, I actually don't know the number in terms of in the United States where it was not available, what the numbers were. You'll get different numbers depending on what side of the argument you're at. But I know around the world that, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of women dying from illegal abortions still today. And, you know, you maybe saw in the paper that women in El Salvador and many Central and Latin American countries are advised not to get pregnant for a couple of years because of a virus causing birth defects. These are countries where they have, where abortion is illegal and where there is very limited, if any, birth control available. So now you tell me how that's going to work. And so I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done, and the U.S. is one of the countries that can set an example, and you know what happens here affects what happens to those hundreds of thousands of women elsewhere who need the help.
And also, I agree that children are a blessing, but I also think we don't talk about the number of women who die having in childbirth, and also not having access to affordable health care, again, which Planned Parenthood provides, so that if you do choose to carry a pregnancy to birth, that it's a healthy mother and a healthy baby. Those numbers aren't talked about either.
And I think I think a visual reminder, this has been one of my secret activist dreams, because you've all seen the crosses in memory of the lives of aborted children. They moved it back in Goshen, so it's not as close to the street as it used to be. But I thought, you know, what if we got thousands of those wire hangers and dumped them at the base of the cross? I mean,
there's a practical application of visuals. I think, you know, figuring out how we're going to make visual some of these, some aspects of the argument that came up today. So thank you so much for staying for this discussion. I hope you'll talk with people around you, that you'll introduce yourself to Lynn Coleman, thank our panelists, and also please consider signing up if you're not already receiving our monthly emails from Planned Parenthood, the Community Action Board. We're working on better sex ed in the schools. We're working on education in the community. I hope you'll consider taking a book if you haven't yet read Katha Pollitt's Pro. And again, if you just have time to read the first chapter, she really gives you some useful tactics for expanding the ways we talk about this, talking about abortion as a moral and ethical good for communities to have children who are wanted coming into the world. So thanks so much. Please hang out and talk with one another, and thank you, panelists. Thank you so much. So one more quick thing, I forgot, our next meeting.
There's an election coming up too.
Okay, good, yeah, go ahead.
Election.
Yes.
Register to vote and you
Yeah,
can't vote.
good. And our the next Planned Parenthood Community Action Board meeting is February 18th. It's a Thursday, 6 o'clock. So if you get on our board, we'll tell you a little bit more. It's at the Planned Parenthood in Mishawaka on Great River.
But that's why, you know, I don't think